Welcome to the Forged by Trust podcast. I'm your host, Robin Dreek, former U.S. Marine, spy recruiter, best-selling author, and your trust and communication expert. Today's episode is brought to you by my good friend, John Robertson, and his insightful book, Run Towards the Roar. Did you ever wonder if there was a different way to view thriving and living? Author John Robertson did, as he kept seeing people reacting to issues after the fact. When a roar happens in life, there are normal fight, flight, freeze, and appease reactions. But what would happen if we ran toward the roar instead of merely reacting? Instead of treating roars, storms, and crises as something to react to and try to avoid, we can plan for them so that we respond instead of reacting. Sometimes the theme of resilience, well-being, and thriving becomes so clinical, theoretical, or pie in the sky that it is not practical or helpful. Like so many educational approaches, oftentimes the approach tends to be a transfer of information rather than transformation. The book Run Toward the Roar reframes thriving and resilience to find and focus on what you love so that you will be faithful and loyal regardless of the roars that cross your path. Coming up next on the Forged by Trust podcast.
And over the years, I've done a whole bunch of crisis intervention work. And one of the key themes that people have to memorize, the event is never the real crisis. Because I believe that humans are naturally resilient. I believe that humans naturally want to thrive. Therefore, what am I doing to help that happen? One of the things that we have to help people to do is stop reacting, quote unquote, like normal humans, fight, flight, freeze, appease, and figure out what's really of value to us so that we run toward the roar.
Welcome to the show. I'm Robin Dreek, and on the Forged by Trust podcast, we decode the interpersonal communication skills of the world's most acclaimed forgers of trust. We unlock the skills and techniques from spies, spy recruiters, master interrogators, globally recognized behavioral experts, C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, acclaimed authors, and thought leaders. Each episode provides specific actions that you can immediately apply to any aspect of your personal or professional life. Today's episode, Workforce Wellness, is with my good friend and workforce wellness expert, John Robertson. John Robertson is the founder and president of FORTLOG Services. John built his services with a focus on an encouragement-based approach, resolving root causes as opposed to treating crisis and transition in the workplace symptomatically, as is often the practice. Inspired and driven by his values, John acts as a facilitator, coach, guide for his clients as they test, discover, and expand what they can do. He uses concrete, verifiable processes to help them achieve demonstrable, solution-focused results. Remaining faithful to his passions and principles, John invests himself in his vocation without reservation. He provides spirit-filled, insightful guidance that his clients use to amplify their lives and their businesses. John truly provides the leadership people can follow through storms. During today's episode, we talk about workforce wellness, the importance of a support network, future-focused encouragement, coaching people through trauma and grief, and how to define your values. So John, hey, welcome to the show. I've been so looking forward to this workplace wellness and dealing with trauma and all those types of things and crisis response. It's a topic we haven't hit before, but it's something that is so critical in people's lives and all aspects of it. So when you reached out to me, I just was so excited about that topic. So with that, John, I just want to dive right into one of my favorite questions of all times, and that is, what sparked that in your life to follow this pursuit of crisis?
So how did I get started in this is actually, when you discover your passion, we're not actually taught as young people how to pursue our passion. It becomes more of an emotional whim. That's not passion. That's like a feeling. And what I got started with was I got tired of watching people treat symptoms. And, it's that kind of, do you not get tired of just doing the same things over and over, hoping for different results? And we know what that's the definition of it.
So I'm curious, you said you got sick of seeing people just treating symptoms.
What was your first experience? Do you remember when you first started noticing that people were treating symptoms, and what were those symptoms they were treating?
Well, we were living in Eastern Canada at the time. It's called the Maritimes, and we had a brutal mine disaster.
Ooh.
And we had some friends who were basically, since they came back from the rescue work, they're not in a good place. Would you be willing to come and meet with them?
Right.
And alcohol was the tool used for coping.
And what was your role at the time that they asked you?
I was actually a clergy pastor, minister in the community.
And is that your background, John?
One of the things that I have, yes.
Okay, so at this time, and how old were you when this happened, roughly?
I'm going to ballpark late 20s, early 30s.
Wow,
I don't remember. So
good. Yeah, that's good. Just ballpark for my friend.
So just kind of like 5-10
couple years ago. Right.
Yeah.
Just like me.
Yeah. And I'm a real boy. And what happened was one of them described a situation they ran into underground, and they were all upset and everything. And I just had to stop, hold it. If you go into that environment, I don't understand why that environment bothering you is a problem. Why are we having this conversation? I mean, to be blunt, if this didn't bother you, we have a problem.
Right.
Well, geez, I never thought of it that way. I thought of what's the matter with me? Yeah, because you're talking about the symptoms. You're not talking about, okay, how did you end up in this place?
Right.
And over the years, I've done a whole bunch of crisis intervention work. And one of the key themes that people have to memorize, the event is never the real crisis. You having a cold or symptoms or whatever I'm supposed to call it might be a crisis for some people because they've never been sick. For somebody else, it's like parents with very young children. They're always sick. So it's not the event, and that's key. And so a marriage that puts the boat up on the sandbar, parenting. Okay, what's the crisis here? And this is key in the workplace. So for example, I don't know what your journey's been like, but Robin, the number of people that we are friends we are hearing being diagnosed with cancer of some form. Mm-hmm. It's like, it can almost become autopilot response. Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. But if it doesn't bother us, that's when we have a problem.
Right. Are you seeing it not bothering people as much these days?
Well, it's acclimatized is the best way to get used. It's the new norm as people use without thinking about, okay, what are we defining as the new norm?
So you started with the story in your 20s or 30s, with this first crisis, which is a life of service. What sparked that desire to be in a life of service?
Because I believe that humans are naturally resilient. I believe that humans naturally want to thrive. Therefore, what am I doing to help that happen? So part of the whole premise of the book that I wrote, Run Toward the Roar. And one of the things that we have to help people to do is stop reacting, quote unquote, like normal humans, fight, flight, freeze, appease, and figure out what's really of value to us so that we run toward the roar.
When you were younger, what was it? Because you said you went into ministry. Was that what you wanted to do when you were growing up? I mean, what was the first thing that kind of entered your mind when you were younger?
Actually, I went to university to be a doctor, an MD.
So still serving.
and it was our GP who said that, actually, and I'll never forget, and I hope your listeners don't judge me because of dark humor, but I still remember our GP sitting down with, John, you must be really glad you didn't make it into the medical school. Kathy, why would you say that? Oh, because you'd be up for so many charges. Really? Do you think, and then of course I went dark and thought about all the evil thing that people could do, and oh, don't be so perverted. That's not what I meant. Okay, Kathy, what did you mean? And she said, with the people I'm paid to listen to day in, day out, I could hear you. I'm sorry, sir. There is no pill for stupid or lazy. What is it you want me to do? And, and that's why I've run into issues and, all kinds of journey stories. But one of the things that I've learned is, do you want to fish or get off the pot? And
Right.
yes, that's a mixed metaphor on purpose. But a lot of times we want things to change and be different, but I don't want to have to do that short-term cost.
Right. What made you want to be a doctor?
Do you know what? I got to be really honest with you. I never really thought about it. I don't know why. I guess part of it, rationalizing, part of it was I did really well in sciences in high school.
Uh-huh. What was that background like that it's like, all right, I'm good at science, so now we're going to make this transition into I want to be a doctor? Was it people around you doctors? Did you see a lot of doctors?
No, nobody. And I think part of what might have come into play is status, prestige, the image of
Right.
being a doctor. I don't know. I never really, first, second year university, I can be honest with you, Robin, I hated my courses and my marks showed it.
Right.
So, you know what, John, man up. It's time for you to figure out what you really want to be, not what you think or feel you want to be.
Would you say that was one of your first crises that you dealt with? Was like you go to university to be a doctor and now you're saying to yourself, maybe not.
Well, actually, I had both university, Robin, but the first one was in the US, it's called ESPN. In Canada, it's called TSN, but it was my ESPN turning point. I went as well as invited to play football and I blew my knee out. And then,
right. So there's another one.
Yeah. And it was kind of one of those pain moments because the surgery was the only option in that era. Surgery was the only option to fix it and guaranteed me arthritis within 10 years. Do you want to fix it or do you want to let it heal and yada, yada, yada. So that was kind of my first turning point to say, okay, so even if I'm not that great at football, it's no longer even an option. Then came the medical stuff. So I ended up going into psychology, and I actually really loved that. It's called developmental psychology. Yes. So when we're children and then young adults, and I love that progressive, strategic, whatever developmental approach to, rather than trying to hatch a mature adult, what are we doing to grow them?
Right. Do you remember what sparked that?
It was taking a basic psych. I think it was called Psych 101, but whatever. And the professor's name was Dr. Marshall. And I'll never forget it. Because he said, now, just before we get in, it was called abnormal psych. Just before we get into all this stuff, I'm going to tell you where we're going to end up. You are all going to be convinced that you were all messed up and you have all kinds of issues and you are completely abnormal. So with that preamble, let's get into abnormal psych.
Right.
And sure enough, Robin, it was kind of one of the, holy geez, I do that. Well, I do that. Well, and by the end of it, we're all, yeah, wow, am I ever screwed up?
I know every time you read a book on trauma or anything, it's like it destroys you for a couple of weeks at least.
and yeah, for at least. And if we don't have the community around us, the support network, and we read that stuff, we can very quickly start to believe the lies that get formed in the head. And Robin, right. I know who your worst critic is. You know who mine is.
You.
And so what happens is when we read that kind of stuff, I love the foolishness that people have used over the years for providing feedback, the sandwich model. You give them something positive, then you give them what's called constructive feedback, and then you end on something positive. That the fact is, the human brain has a negative bias. We pick up on things that are negative, especially if they're directed to us.
Right.
So instead of focusing on rationalizing constructive feedback, reframe it as valuable feedback to say, okay, John, this is the behavior I'm seeing. Can you help me to understand how it's reflecting your values or what you want me to see? What is wellness? That same discussion, Robin. So, John, what would it mean for you to be well and healthy in this workplace?
So what was next that drove this progression through your life? And I'm starting to see a spike of curiosity when it comes to humans.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
That we started, your curiosity of understanding why people were doing what they were doing.
And the other part that you put your finger on is understanding why humans do what we have done.
Right.
But also understanding why humans want to do what they want to do.
Right.
So, for example, most people don't think about it, but why going backwards is a negative question, punitive question. Robin, why would you do that? Robin, why did you do that? Robin, and all the bang on the head why questions. Parents do it with their kids. Well, why did you do that? Why didn't you say no to them? The other part of that why is a future-focused question. Why is that important for you? Why does that matter for you? Why do you want to achieve that? And that becomes a motivational approach. Mm-hmm. This is punitive. It's the experts in the stands. It's the ones who have all the insights after something has happened. This future focused requires you and I to get to know what matters to them so that we can encourage them.
So what was that next step that started this transition?
I actually went into a church so my master's degree was for theology, pastoring. Okay. And then when we moved to a small community, so that was my first one was in the Maritimes. The second one was kind of Northern Ontario and in Canada. And we had a small community and we had a whole bunch of little crises, big crises. And so from business closures to horrific motor vehicle collision to hospital staff being walloped to the neighboring town, had the local district hospital. And because a small town has a very distinct set of rules.
Right.
If you get to know the right people, when they ask you for help, we either go help them or we need to move. Because once you burn that relationship in a small community, we often don't get a second chance.
Right.
And we became friends of one of the people. He was chief of staff at the hospital. And he called me one day for this motor vehicle collision. And he said, I need you to come and talk to the nurses. Huge wallop. And I said, PJ, about what? Well, John, it's 20 minutes from your house to the hospital. That gives you 19 to figure that out. Click. And because I don't believe in fixing people, I don't believe in diagnosing people, and I don't believe in telling people what they should have done, I went up and met with people, staff, just to say, so what's going on? How do you know this is impacting you? And we walked through some of their sign signals, reactions, if you will.
Right.
And then we talked about G-rated, but what do you do to normalize stress reactions? And then what came out of that was, okay, but why wouldn't this bother you? and reframe the whole discussion. And what's happening in the workforce today, in the whole wellness discussion, is we're syndromizing. I don't know if that's a word, but let's pretend it is. But everybody's got a syndrome rather than saying, yeah, your syndrome is called being human.
Right.
And we've misinterpreted praise and encouragement. Praise is I pat you on the back or pat you on the head, tell you what a wonderful boy am I kind of model message. Encouragement, the prefix en, means to instill. So to encourage a person means to help instill courage.
Right. So tell me about that. So what's different about how your way of coaching people through trauma and crisis it differs from the traditional ways that people generally think of it?
Well, first of all, I'm not approaching it from a medical model, even though I went in starting that way.
Right.
Because many medical models are not about getting people healthy or keeping people healthy or helping people thrive. They're more about treating sick or treating ill, which is phenomenal. Like, don't misinterpret me. There's no harm in that. But if we mistranslate healthcare as sick care, then we have to help people reframe. No, treating injured or sick is not the same as keeping healthy.
Right.
And so what came out of it for me is that model to say, yeah, you know what? You get a Charlie horse, an emotional one, a spiritual one, a psychological one. Talk to somebody who's been through a divorce. And let me illustrate this. Robin, do you have any friends who have been through a divorce, an ugly divorce?
We'll say yes.
Okay. And part of what happens is they go through that Charlie horse, and not only are they losing their partner spouse, but they end up losing friends.
Right.
Because people say, well, I can't choose between John and Carolyn.
Right.
So I'm not going to be either friend. Instead of, you know what, you guys have chosen to split up. That's your right. However, I am not choosing between both of you. If you want me to choose between you and your ex-spouse, then heads up, you will lose.
Right.
Because I'm not choosing. I will be both your friends. I'm not going to malign either one of you, but I'm not going to be your rope.
So what do you tell them to do?
Let's talk through about what does it mean to redefine or reframe normal.
Right.
Because historically, and I mean, as tragic as it sounds, I have a sister who is going through this. She and her husband, their daughter battled cancer for 15 years and just died in April this year.
Oof.
And yeah, and she gave up. She was a lawyer. She gave up her legal profession because she was doing all the hospital runs for treatment.
Right.
They're in that season right now of reframing, redefining what norm looks like. 15 years, it has been living the roller coaster that they couldn't get off.
So that's a really powerful example. You have someone that was battling with a child suffering from cancer for all that time. What do you do to help someone through that?
First things first is somewhere along the line, stupid kicked into grief work. And I say that really bluntly because people get, well, grief should take about 2 years. That's balderdash.
Depends on who it is, right?
And it depends. It takes the time it takes if
Right.
we're doing the work
Right.
to move forward.
What's that work look like?
It's called resolving, reconciling, because there is, first of all, to reframe it, there's no such thing as grief recovery. Can you imagine, Robin, I'm going to pry, but do you have a child or children?
Yep. I got 2. Yep.
So can you imagine if I told you to say, well, Robin, one of your children has died. Well, it'll take you about 2 years until you get over it.
Nope, never.
And I mean, but that's the thinking that people apply, and it's foolish. It's not a broken arm. You're not recovering.
Right.
We resolve it. We admit, acknowledge it, but we also have to address how we resolve it. And that means understanding, how do I deal with grief? How do I deal with loss? Most people think grief is tied to death. It is not. I know this is hard to believe. And for those of you listening, not watching, you'll recognize my highlights in my hair. And it gives me the mature look, and they're called gray everywhere else. But one of the things that I've learned is my brain says you're 21, and I go to do something like I'm 21, and my body says, you are so going to pay for this. Grief. The loss that I am not 21, that my recovery time is not what it was when I was 21 years old. Some people really struggle with that reality of aging.
Right.
But it's not death. Loss of a job, grief recovery, loss of a spouse over in the workplace, loss of job security, loss of promotion that I was skipped over in the promotion, all kinds of things. And what happens is helping people, and I don't even like using the term because it's not about getting through it, but helping people deal and resolve with their loss so that they can come through on the other side in a healthy, positive new norm.
What's the first step? What's the first thing you say to them?
First thing I say is grief is not intellectual. It will not make sense. And we do it all the time. They've gone to a better place. Really? Think about the unhelpful one-liners, cliches.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
When my sister died, so my other sister, when she died, I had one guy show up at the funeral home, and I am the wrong person to use cliches on because of my journey. And he did the meet and greet and a whole bunch of behaviors that he already annoyed me. And then in the lineup, he says, sorry to hear about your sister. Thank you. And then he said, I know how you feel. And, I wasn't aware your sister died. Well, she didn't. Well, then how do you know how I feel? And at that moment, I felt an elbow in my ribs, not my own.
Right.
And we do that to people because we try and intellectualize something that's not intellectual.
Right.
And emotions don't make sense.
How do you help people through those emotions? Like, how do you help yourself through that? And then how do you translate that to someone else going through that journey?
So the premise behind it is called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right.
If I start with my emotions, if we start with our emotions, we behave according to our emotions, which means we call it, and then we think according to the behavior. A friend of ours called it stinky thinking. I call it the eddy effect.
Right.
Emotions, behaviors, and it's just like a toilet bowl. We start to swirl and go down.
Right.
The bearing solution is we have to start with our thinking. So what do I want? Because I'm not going to pretend that this loss didn't happen.
Right.
So what is my thinking? And then behave according to that thinking. So and then my emotions, because they're responders, follow my behavior. I grew up in a very strong Scottish home. One of the parenting models that I grew up with was, if you're going to cry, I'll bloody well give you something to cry about.
Right.
Not a great grief resolution model.
Right.
And there's no harm in tears. So start with the thinking. Start with, and there's different places to start, but start with, okay, what are some of the themes or norms that I've grown up with of dealing with loss? And I still remember this one woman, she was in her 80s. I was meeting with, doing some group training. And Robin, she took me in, and I'll use the line on purpose. She took me in hook, line, and sinker. And she said, well, my first boyfriend was a carp. I said, a carp? Well, yeah. Well, I said, was that a last name, a first name? Because the only carp I know is a fish.
Right.
And she said, well, that's what I'm talking about. I said, okay, your first boyfriend was a fish? Yes. And she made this story 5 minutes long. And then she started to smile with that grandmother smile. And she says, yes, because everywhere I turned, everybody kept telling me, with the loss of my first boyfriend, they kept saying, well, there's all kinds of fish in the sea. And she took me right in and made this great story. But think about that high school person or younger with the loss of their first love, whatever that means.
Right.
Well, there's all kinds of fish in the sea. And honestly, tying it back to work, this is what's so, just to illustrate what really gets up my kilt, or a stone in the shoe, or whatever expression, is I have a person I know. He was told by an expert in the workplace and team building and all the other stuff. He said, you need to keep your work life and personal life separate. That was the dad of my niece who was battling cancer. Yeah, that wasn't his first response. Okay, he just about packed up and left the meeting and said, you know what? And his comment was, I cannot say anything right now because what will come out of my mouth will not be good.
Right.
And what do we do with workforce wellness? We make it this lofty, nebulous, pie in the sky stuff, rather than just simply saying, okay, you want me to trust you, or I want to trust you. Then these moments of loss are the fires that refine us, or if you want me to use this wise cliche, that forge us. And trust is made or broken in those forges.
Right.
Because it's refining.
So what do we do for workplace wellness to start that forging of new trust and a better place for us to work and cooperate and want to go every day, shifting our mindset from I have to do this to I get to do this?
Well, first thing is, if it's not of value, if the work that I'm doing and using your gifts, your passion, your nature, your personality, your values, if that's not what you're doing, then go find other work.
I want to stop there because you mentioned this once already too, and you mentioned how hard that is to find.
Yep.
How does someone find their values? Probably the toughest question in the world to answer are why. How do we find that value?
Well, one of the things that I start with people in organizations is the values. So I give them a template of values to sort through. And I always have blanks at the bottom because somebody always says, well, you're missing some. Okay, fill them in. But all values have to have a name, a definition, but the key is the description, because that's going to be the stuff that comes out in the refiner's fire, in hot water. And so therefore, you and I could talk about a core value of whatever, encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the behavior, it's the description that's most important for trust.
Sure.
So for example, if I say, well, Robin, I want you to know that I'm here. I want to encourage you. But every time you feel like you're up to your neck in alligators, you would rather put your head in a vice than be encouraged by John.
Right.
Then I'm not encouraging you.
Right.
And so one of the things that workplaces, especially leaders, have to do is, what does success get measured by? and think of the term evaluated. If
Right.
we don't have a value, definition, and description, we can't evaluate anything. So trust, one of the things that I focus my trustability around is not about John being liked by everybody. Can they turn their backs on John? Is he trustable? Is he followable? Is he respectable? Even if he's not likable. Because
Right.
I want you to know that if your boat is leaking, it has a hole in it, I will not be that person on shore saying, paddle harder.
Mhm.
I want to be the one in your boat saying, now this is exciting. Let's roll.
So you help someone identify their values
Mhm.
and what they're looking for. What happens when they realize with you that, all right, this place is not meeting those values, it's not meeting that level? What do we do?
Then we look at, in high school, it's called guidance counseling. In adults, it's called career counseling.
Right.
But that's what we do. We help them. And I mean, Jim Collins wrote about it years ago in Good to Great. Great organizations are not good places for everyone to work. We either fit and flourish or we get expunged like a virus. And if this isn't the right place, I need to find that right place. But the key is the values, because values are what we are for, not what we're against.
Right.
And that's key. Well, I don't like this and I don't like that. And I don't, okay, I appreciate everything you don't like. What do you like? What do you want? Why is that important for you?
Nice. Run Towards the Roar, because that's such a great title. Tell me about that.
Well, the premise behind it is passio fidelis. It's a term I invented. Passio is the root word of passion, and fidelis is the root word of fidelity, faithfulness, loyalty.
Right.
And so when I define in a refinable way, like it's not a once and done, so for example, and I'm not doing a squirrel moment on you, I'm going to come
No, I
back
love
to
squirrel moments anyway, so keep going.
Okay. So my definition of a core value of family was this: not sitting in front of a TV. It was training them up according to their wiring. Now that we've started into the grandparent thing, highly recommended, by the way, but now that we've started into that, our definition of family is less about training them up according to their wiring, but it's more about encouraging and being present so that they know they've got an advocate in their leaky boat.
Right.
And so when we define our values, then we build that community to say, okay, what do I want to move forward with? How do I want to grow forward? And then we start looking at the ABCs. So our attitudes, our beliefs, and our connections around those values. Passio fidelis is the term that allows us to run toward the roar. Because if you and I are passionate about something, pick a sport. If you and I get injured playing a sport we love, we will find a way to get back into the game. If we are playing a game we don't enjoy, any injury takes us out.
Right.
The best example I've seen of this, Robin, and I'm not Canadian Forces background or military background, but the best example of this that I can see is the number of military personnel who want to get back to their group.
Right.
Because that's where their values lie.
Right.
But there's an ethos. There's that who's got your back and trust. And flip side of that is when I break trust in the military model, very, very seldom will I get a second chance.
What's the first step someone can take with you or with someone else to start understanding, like even recognizing this might be a semblance of what that passion is, because it gives us that first compass heading to move towards.
And I'm not a linguistic major, but I love using, what's that term? Etymology, which is
entomology. Yep. I've had other guests talk about that. Yep.
okay. I love using etymology. For example, most people think of success, but don't think of how we define it.
Right.
So the bumper sticker, the one with the most toys, wins. That's a lie.
No,
Hearses don't have luggage racks, so wins what? And therefore, success, the etymology of success comes from the same root word as successive integers or successor to the throne. What do I choose to come under? What is our passion? What am I choosing to come under that I am willing to put my life, my all into that? It's like being married, or, for better, for worse, unless something better comes along. I can tell you how that's going to end. And so first of all, define what success means. I'm not going to be at my funeral, but I don't want people at my funeral for the will. I want people to say, this is how John was a stone in the shoe, but an encourager.
Right.
Second part of that is learning to say a 4-letter word, help.
Right.
And asking the people who say a 4-letter word, care or love.
Right.
And that's probably the hardest part of finding one's passion values, having those people who use all those 4-letter words, care, love, help. And Robin, think about your journey. And I'm not asking you to name them if that's not what you want to do. But do you have those half dozen people who have spoken truthfully, honestly, whatever, in love, but have really helped you thrive?
Oh, absolutely. Got a couple Marines. I got a couple people in high school. I got the hands down my wife and kids. Yep. 100%.
And life is not a solo sport. And that's probably the hardest part about defining our refinable new norm.
So here's a common question and a common challenge I see, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on it. I know quite a few people that have a why and their purpose of they just want to help people. They went to college, they majored in degrees that they just want to help people.
Yep.
Yet they keep struggling with the start. How do you encourage them to move, or what's the answer for them?
Well, simplest question is, I don't assume I know what they mean by help. And like a desktop icon on our computers, double click on it. So what do you mean help people? What does that mean? Like if you were a billionaire, you could help people.
Right.
So what do you mean help? And so, for example, like if somebody says, I really want to help people know how to move beyond being feared or being fearful of an addiction recurring, or whatever the term is.
Great one.
Okay, well, that's a very different form of helping.
Right.
Than I want to help people deal with addictions.
Right.
Way different, because one can be treating illness, sick care. The other one's actually helping people grow healthy.
Right. Yeah, it's great advice and guidance. John, what would be like maybe 2 or 3 things, or maybe just one, to help people start that journey today to creating that healthy work environment and deal with crisis that they could take away from this?
So first of all, look at the traditional crisis response. Look at when a crisis happens, and keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, Robin, the event is never the real crisis. So the first thing is, when there is a crisis, number one, what's the normal approach? Because you can't adjust anything if you don't know where you're starting from.
Right.
The flip side is the exact opposite end of that same journey. What do you want people to experience when a crisis happens? And then start to build out the steps. Okay, we do really well at this. We need to adjust this. We do really well at this. I didn't even know we should do that. So, for example, many workplaces have their crisis response is they call an EAP, an employee assistance program.
Right.
Get somebody on site and let's all join hands, sing kumbaya, and okay, crisis has been dealt with. Now let's move on. That's never going to work.
Right.
Because the COVID is perfect illustration. The longer people are head down, just trying to get through it, the further out the intervention needs to be held.
Right.
Because they've been playing just to get through the game, just to finish. And we see this all the time in injured athletes. They play injured and they spend the first 3 months of their off season recovering from their injuries. In the workplace, tactical is really, really important. So, for example, if there's been a crisis, go back and ask people, what did we do well? Now, my second question, before you answer what we did well, my second question is, what did we royally stink at?
Right.
Because we need people to finish well. So what did we do well? Also, what did we stink at? And then do you have ideas? And helping get a triage of where we are actually, the organization is actually starting from is key.
Right. Fantastic. John, what are, if anything, that you wanted to share that I was a horrible host and forgot to ask you that you wanted to make sure you shared with everyone before we go?
Actually, Robin, as much as this sounds schmoozy or blowing sunshine, you've been a great host and I've loved the conversation. So the only thing I would add or offer is have people email me, john@fortlog.co, and it should be in the show notes, I believe.
Yep.
You said, Robin. Yeah.
Yep. And that was the final question, is where can people find out more about you?
Okay. And one of the things that help, and FORTLOG is Fort, safe place in the frontier. A log is a journal to sail the seas, because there's no point going there alone. It's .co because I work with people alongside, collaborate, colleague, coach, and that's the .co on purpose. But one of the things that I'm really encouraging your listeners is employ somebody, not hire financially, but involve somebody that is busy to encourage you. Do not ask unbusy people, because they tend to volunteer for things because they have nothing else to do. Ask a busy person to do a job, they get it done. So when you think about the community, ask a busy person to say, I really want to grow in this area, or our workplace, I really want to strengthen the workplace in this area. Would you be willing to give me whatever, an hour a day, an hour a week, an hour a month, whatever you think is reasonable?
That's really good advice going for the busy person, by the way. You choose a horse. Absolutely. That's really good.
Yeah. And there's like, and I go right back to my ministry days where God, in whether you're Jewish, Christian, or a variety of religions, God doesn't ask for volunteers. God, Allah, picks people. Right. And there's a reason that thinking is there. Because volunteers tend to have, well, nothing else to do with their time. And as cynical as that sounds, I've learned the hard way, I have to ask busy people. Yes, a 4-letter word. But one of the things is connect with me. I want to be that encourager. Choose wisely the people you let in your boat. Right. And then, lean forward to say, when I finish, I want to finish well. And here's what finishing well means for me. So to pick on the theme, I want to be finishing well so that I have been part of that community who have been forging trust so that leaders thrive, and as a result, their people do as well.
Poetic and beautiful. John, I love your 4-letter words a lot. Love, care. Those are just two of the most powerful ones you can do to be a great resource for others, for yourself, and keep moving forward in life with great purpose. John, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today, sharing your insights and sharing yourself with the rest of the world to make it a better place. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to let me be a guest. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Forged by Trust. If you took away at least one new idea, make a note of it and pass it on to someone else who may need it. If you are interested in more information about how I can help you forge your own trust building, communication, interpersonal strategies for yourself or your organization, please visit my website at www.peopleformula.com. I'm looking forward to sharing my next Forge and Trust episode with you next week when we chat with my good friend Stephanie Paul, a world-acclaimed keynote speaker, trainer, and coach, as well as founder and head of training and development in communication.